If you look at Russia today, it's even less interested in aggrandizing to the West. I think the Russians learned their lesson um, with Stalin in the Cold War, that the occupation of obdurate and unhappy and highly resistant civilizations, like the Poles or the Czechs or the Hungarians or Romanians, they're an albatross around your neck.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am John Batchelor, Gaius, and Germanicus is here, Michael Vlahos. I greet him. We're in Londinium. It's 91 AD, late summer. The centurions and their families have had a good day of shopping, and they're headed home. We're drinking by the Thames, our cup of wine, second cup of wine. We're Equus class, meaning we don't have the money to be senators, wouldn't want to be anyway. Senate is dangerous. Equus class means maybe 100,000 sesterces if you're lucky. Senator, million plus, easy. But that's not us. We observe. We do not write things down, however. Recently, that's been restated to me. Do not write things down, because documents can be used by unfriendly forces. We, however, are observing not our own century, the first century AD. We're observing the 21st century AD, 2,000 years from now. And some bumpy parts of the 21st century stem from the 20th century. So we're going to wind the clock back from 2024 to 1914 and the Great War, 1914 to 1918. The combatants to this day are not at all clear for themselves why it started. To this day, there is an argument to be made that no one wanted this war and that they all got into it without reason. They just followed along. Orders were given, momentum. However, we're here to talk about not the Great War, Austria, Hungary, and Germany, the Central Powers, along with Bulgaria, versus the Entente. That would be Britain, France, Russia, Serbia. No, we're here to talk about America's position towards the Great War. Woodrow Wilson is president in 1914. He's been successful so far with what he called the preparedness campaign later on. That is, we're ready to fight, but we're too proud to fight. 1914, 1915, it works for him. And then there's the incident with Lusitania. And then there's Teddy Roosevelt pounding the drums for participating. And then there's the election of 16. Wilson barely beats Charles Evans Hughes and is returned to the White House. However, the war in Europe has turned monstrously, ghastly. Everyone knows the casualty lists are vast. America doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And neither did Wilson in 14, neither did Wilson in 15, neither did Wilson in 16. And then there are several incidents. At Christmas time 16, that would be Wilson sending a note saying, I'm ready to arbitrate in some fashion. And then in early 17, there is an incident that still is a little vague about a note from Zimmerman, the German foreign minister, to Mexico City, encouraging his ambassador to entice the Mexican government to attack America, saying that we'll provide you California if you do this for us. And by the way, the Japanese are ready to come in on your side. Nonsense like this. However, that note is used by the British Secret Service, goes one version, to inflame Woodrow Wilson. Wilson doesn't need much more than that. And then the Germans provide what becomes the casus belli, which is declaring unrestricted submarine warfare. Well, Wilson then decides that his years of being against participating in the war go away. He asks Congress for declaration of war on the Central Powers in early April, and America's at war. However, good evening to you, Germanicus. There was a strong voice that said Wilson was wrong. Wilson was always wrong. Roosevelt agreed with him. In fact, he agreed with Roosevelt at this point. But that voice, it's none of our affair. We're not going to get involved. Nothing will be resolved. We've been at this forever. That's why we left Europe. It goes on like that. Later on, that became, in the 1950s, isolationism. Well, here we are again, Germanicus. I observe you and I have recently familiarized ourselves with the Eastern Front. The Western Front looks like Yankee Doodle Dandy arrives to rescue our French and British allies. Well, bunkum in the East Front. It was all bloodlands. They were working this territory over long before 1914, and they've been working it over ever since, hence the Ukraine war. So, the isolationism, so-called, it's Woodrow Wilson, 14 to 16. It's America in that period. It's none of our affair. Is America wrong, Germanicus? Good evening to you.
Good evening, Gaius. America was founded to be, shall we say, above and yet apart. So the famous motto that is associated with Washington's farewell address, Novus Ordo Secolorum, a new order for the ages, has meant to Americans, at least for their first century or so, even longer, to be that we are a beacon to the world, an example to the world, a model for the world, but we are not going to get engaged in power politics because they are corrupting and they will corrupt us. Well, that attitude persevered in the US well past the Civil War and even into the period before World War I, where by 1910, the US had 30% of the world's manufacturing output and was effectively a superpower. It also had one of the three largest navies in the world, the other two being Britain and Japan, and the US had an effective capability to participate in world affairs without getting sucked into, again, what Washington called entangling alliances. And, you know, the US had a sense of what could go wrong there because effectively, one political party in the US was pro-Napoleon, and their support of Napoleon ended ensnaring us in part in the War of 1812, which resulted in several British invasions toward the end of the war and was overall a mess. And many of the feelings that Americans still had at the time of World War I saw Britain as an untrustworthy actor and as a partner that would be looking to take advantage of us. And certainly the fact that Britain waged a proxy war against the federal US government during the Civil War by sustaining the South and was the lifeline of the Confederacy, in fact, is still something that people in the North remembered especially. So the American people have been wary of getting engaged abroad and only put that aside given the cataclysm of World War II. And yet World War II, at least in terms of America's engagement, was engineered by Mr. Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who worked assiduously for years to get America involved in the war and finally essentially declared war on Japan by threatening to shut down their economy. He cut off oil and he cut off scrap steel, and that accounted for Japan's entire manufacturing capability. It was going down the drain, and it was clearly a matter of months only before the Japanese had to either surrender to the United States or strike the United States. And so Americans didn't want to go to war in 1939 or 40 or 41 either. And it's only been in the wake of World War II, with the fact of the Axis powers being replaced by the Red Menace and a Red Eurasia, that the US took up this long twilight struggle. And yet it won that struggle, and yet the US kept on pushing to manage the world. And the fact is, Washington's adjuration about foreign entanglements and the corruption of foreign entanglements has proven to be correct. In other words, America became like the powers that were bleeding themselves to death in World War I, and as the triumphant victor in the Cold War, sought to essentially continue a world empire, a world under the aegis and leadership of the United States. And when that was threatened by the rise of other powers eventually, especially China, the US refused to entertain another approach to the world. And that helps to explain to a large degree the situation that we're in now. And Americans have come to their senses. At least I think the majority of Americans have. They don't want to go to war over the Middle East. They don't want to go to war over the bloodlands of Eastern Europe. And they don't particularly want to go to war with China.
It's a fair question. We'll come back to this because the Biden administration says as long as it takes, and if Ms. Harris is the winner in November, I don't see her breaking from that pattern. She's not indicated in any fashion she means to break away from Ukraine. We know our allies in NATO are depending upon us to lead the support of Ukraine. Mr. Trump has had another opinion. Just all of a sudden reading Eastern Europe again and Nick Lloyd's new history of the Eastern Front, it occurs to me that nothing's changed there, Germanicus. Nothing whatsoever. Galicia disappeared, but it's now called Poland and Ukraine. And the Kremlin's position is we can stomp anybody we want between here and Paris. And that was the position that last few days of, what was it, July 1914, we'll mobilize the Russian army and they'll surrender. And indeed, 1.4 million people get your attention when they all have weapons in their hands.
That's true. Although I would be a little less harsh on Russia then and a lot less harsh on Russia now. Russia in 1914 wanted nothing to do with a war because after the calamity of the Russo-Japanese War and the revolution that followed, Russia understood how weak it was, plus any of the measures of reform that it was taking within the army and building of new north-south railroads that would allow them to mobilize effectively had not been yet undertaken and wouldn't come into play until 1916 and after. And essentially, Russia in 1914, which controlled, I would say, about half of what is today Poland, was not interested really in aggrandizing any further to the west. And if you look at Russia today, it's even less interested in aggrandizing to the west. I think the Russians learned their lesson with Stalin in the Cold War, that the occupation of obdurate and unhappy and highly resistant civilizations, like the Poles or the Czechs or the Hungarians or Romanians, they're an albatross around your neck. So what's interesting about the war that is going on now and may go on for some time is that it really does look like World War I, because you have Western Ukraine, which was effectively part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is arm in arm with Germany, waging war against Russians. It looks a lot like the period of the Brusilov offensive, and the thing that Putin and Russians are afraid of is another Brest-Litovsk.
All right, let me restate. When Russia started to mobilize, that set off a chain reaction.
Yes.
Okay. Russia did not attack. Germany was going to support whatever had to happen because of the assassination in Sarajevo.
Right.
And Austria appealed to Germany the way when Serbia appealed to Russia. I wasn't looking to fault Russia, although there's fault enough for everybody, including Russia.
Totally.
First war. Back to, just to close here, a minute. America involvement in the first war. It wasn't successful, Germanicus. They were back at their throats within days.
And there was nothing we could do, because we found in Versailles that even though we were the god, and at least in terms of the way Europeans looked to Wilson at Versailles, he could not restrain Clemenceau or Lloyd George. The French were determined to destroy Germany, and so the war indeed did not end. And there was ruthless fighting within Germany in the Civil War until 1923.
And Wilson didn't listen to people telling him that.
No.
Wilson had a utopian vision of the world made safe for whatever, fill in the race.
He was a rigid Calvinist evangelical. That's Wilson.
Yes. And our entry into the World War was not successful. It didn't stop the Russian Revolution. It didn't stop the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and all of the poverty that followed. It certainly didn't stop the French and the British from maintaining their empires, their colonial empires, and grabbing what they could of Germany's colonial empire. And the Second War, I understand we have long celebrated our success in the Second War, but what has it come to, Germanicus?
The truth is, the manner of our success, which was total, corrupted us almost from the beginning, so that we were waging a misguided and ultimately corrupt war in Vietnam just 20 years after the end of World War II. And the worst thing that World War II did for us, which was then multiplied by an order of magnitude by our quote-unquote victory in the Cold War, was somehow we took on the mantle of having the right to rule that manifests destiny, which was a terrible term used in the war against Mexico and the expansion of slavery. That kind of attitude, however, became the touchstone for all U.S. behavior since 1991. So we have become the very thing we said, and certainly that George Washington said was anathema, is now we have become the thing we once feared and hated.
Let's go to campaign 2024, because 1914 echoes catastrophe. It'd be good if we could say we're going to avoid it, but it's the same war. It's ongoing. 1914, 2024, same war. It's a late summer afternoon. Everything is lovely. We're going to the theater later. They're Roman mimes. We can hope for historical episodes. It's always funny. Mimes inject a lot of humor. And they don't say anything, so they can't be arrested. Remember, these are actors. And that is a very suspect class in Rome. But they're out here in Londinium. We're very far away. We don't worry about anything happening on the Danube. We don't worry what's happening on the Po. We don't even worry what's happening in the Thames. We're watching 2024. And the success so far of Cleopatra's campaign, her opponent doesn't have an easy version in our century. Little Nero, little Tiberius, and nothing really works. However, I want to come to observe that Cleopatra is doing very well while not telling us anything about the future. She is presenting herself as an alternative and the choice of the other party. And that apparently is enough. Germanicus, do you measure that Cleopatra will continue the alluring idea of a completely different story in the White House is sufficient campaign?
These last several weeks, we have focused on the problem of legitimacy in imperial succession. And your wonderful metaphor of the year of 5 emperors is really apropos here, because as in Rome at its imperial height, imperial succession still depended on legitimacy. And if a claimant or a contender fumbled in the contest for succession, that contender was garroted quickly. And Rome had a kind of succession by not so much valor, but according to competence, capability, and perceived success. They had to be equal to the job, and they had to show that they were equal to the job. When they didn't, like a Nero, they didn't last long. Or if they were contenders in the Roman equivalent of an American general election, which was called a civil war, as in the year four emperors, if they fumbled on the field, or the soldiers didn't sense that they were up to the job, they would defect, and then you'd have another contender grabbing for the grass crown. Now, what's going on here is a shaky operation, and it's been successful largely on the basis of Cleopatra, quote unquote, our Cleopatra, owning the media and able to not cover certain stories and to edit interviews, which has been done for every single one of her interviews. And so you get a kind of a bubble in which all the discussion is about her as a mirror of the terrible, evil troll who is her opponent, first of all. Second of all, it doesn't touch on the fact that she hasn't addressed any of the issues that you call the future, what she will do as president. And third, it is essentially not presenting her as is given. All of that, which was presented while she was vice president, co-emperor, as it were, showing her word salad and her fumbles, all that's gone now. So it's a very tightly controlled presentation, and that has its weakness. It's brittle. And so it's not so much that her opponent could shatter it, because there's no real opportunity for that. And the one that just passed by, the so-called debate, Mr. Trump did not exploit his opportunities to do so. It won't so much be shattered by the opposition with a hammer, but rather by people getting nervous and anxious because they don't see the qualities there, because they're not being shown them. And why are they not being shown them? Well, perhaps that is even riskier. So it is a kind of legitimacy that is rooted in a kind of gamble and race to the finish line. And it's interesting because at our time in Rome, there aren't any women rulers. But later on, in the Greek Roman Empire, which will be called Byzantium, there was an emperor. She even called herself Emperor Basileus, and she was able to rule alone. Her name was Irene, or Irene, and she came to rule because her elderly husband died, and then she became regent to her son. And when the son finally reached majority and there were palace coup rumors surrounding him taking over, she had him killed. And then she ruled alone for a while. And this is interesting given the passage of Ms. Harris to her position. And it wasn't a happy situation for Irene or for Cleopatra or for others we've talked about, like Amalasuintha. The person who doesn't inherently have legitimacy is dependent on her courtier network. And Ms. Harris is completely dependent on a courtier network, plus some of the most powerful princes of the realm, like Mr. Obama and other heavyweights of the former Clinton glory days of the 90s.
Is it working, Germanicus?
It's working on the basis of nothing being overturned. It may not be working on the basis of overall confidence. So what I suggested earlier is that although she has a solid group of courtiers and former players around her who are orchestrating her campaign, it isn't really possible for them to do what she ultimately has to do. And she has to be able to demonstrate legitimacy. She has to be able to have a press conference and come forward as somebody who can actually be the president, just
So
like Imperial Rome.
you think by not doing that, she's not doing well? Because clearly, with 6 weeks to go, there's no indication they'll be any different than what we have now.
It's a gamble. So, with a race as close as it's said to be,
Yeah.
then there is a kind of glide path, and I think I've used the metaphor before. It's like fourth quarter, and you're ahead by 1 point, and there are only a couple minutes left, so you go into the prevent defense, and that seems to be what that campaign is doing. It is based now almost solely upon the attacks on Mr. Trump, and therefore, in some ways, even though there's not going to be another debate, but in some very real, if immeasurable ways, the other side, red, is in a position to still depreciate her claim to legitimacy and the electorate's confidence in her ability to rule as emperor.
Going to the theater later, we've had entertainment talking about 1914, entertainment talking about 2024. Now we're going to talk about our own century, because assassination suggested by another attempted assassination, says the FBI, in the 2024. And the shots were fired. It doesn't appear that the assassin got off, the would-be assassin, the alleged would-be assassin, got off any shots. The Secret Service did. Good for them. We're used to assassination. The one that comes to mind are the conspiracy assassinations, because you take a man like Cataline. He planned to win by massacring all the senators who disagreed with him, all of them. And his plot was given away by a very powerful woman who would later on be married to Mark Antony, named Fulvia, who went to Cicero and told him what Cataline was up to. And Cicero immediately went to the Senate and decried Cataline, who came in and sat down and listened to Cicero denouncing him. The senators were a little bored, but they listened to it. And eventually it became clear that Cataline really did mean to kill half the room, half the Senate, and take over Rome, to become a dictator, something that at that point, that's 63 BC, I believe, BCE, was a curse upon Rome. Later on, after the civil wars, they would relax and have a dictator, although they called him an emperor, or, well, there were many euphemisms, but he was a dictator. Augustus, or Octavian. And Germanicus, I come to you about this idea of assassination. It is a form of succession that we practice routinely in the 1st century AD, and will in the 2nd century AD. But here at the end of the 1st century AD, we know we're just a few years away from Domitian being assassinated by the Senate. So I ask you a deliberately provocative question. Is it such a bad succession tool? Is it really awful, all that awful? It works.
It's, in the words of a famous Pentagon master, Robert McNamara, it is suboptimal in the sense that it works nicely, effectively, as long as you get a ne'er-do-well out of there, like our not so beloved Nero or Domitian. Too often, though, the wrong person is assassinated. Um, the best example of that is in the future Greek Roman Empire in 602. The terrific Emperor Maurice, incredibly accomplished, great general, great philosopher and writer. The army didn't want to fight north of the Danube in winter against the Avars and the Slavs. And so they mutinied, and a general named Phocas killed Maurice and his 5 sons. And Phocas was a disaster, led to the unraveling of the Roman Empire, which barely survived invasions by Persia and the Avars. So this is not necessarily a good thing, although you have to say that a better case could be made for civil wars, because the stronger and better general is probably the correct guy to be emperor. Assassinations result, however, in very terrible things happening. Another is the assassination of Stilicho, the Vandal, who was keeping the Goths at bay. He was assassinated by Honorius, and guess what? Next year, Alaric was entering Rome to ceremoniously sack it. And I said ceremoniously, not unceremoniously, by the way. And again, a few decades later, one of the last great hopes of Rome really was also a Magister Militum, commander-in-chief, Aetius, and he was assassinated by Valentinian III, and Rome unraveled. The Western Roman Empire was gone 2 decades later. So there are lots of examples of that. But assassination in the American context has not really been properly legitimated. So it is even more likely to throw things into chaos. We have succession protocols, as we just saw with the exit of Mr. Biden, and they can be done effectively and quickly. The real problem is the U.S. is an imperial system that is dependent on the emperor, and the emperor thus has to be legitimate, and the emperor's succession has to be legitimate. And the biggest concern now is that we've had a couple emperors, potentially more in a row, who aren't accepted by the necessary majority. And with a third coming up, you could have a situation in which succession itself falls apart.
Germanicus, Mark of Vlahos, Gaius, John Batchelor, by Londinium. We're off to the mime presentation tonight at the theater after we sacrifice to the god Augustus. We're superstitious men. It is the 1st century AD. That's our explanation. Although the 21st century AD is operating very strikingly similar to the way we are. I've got to stop thinking of this as 2,000 years of separation and look for the continuity. The centurions and their families, happy families, have all gone home. The shops are closing up for the day. It's a little chillier than it was. We are in Londinium. Thank you. I'm John Batchelor.